It is time for us to begin. I appreciate the fact that you're here. You have suffered enough for one quarter. After today, Brother Scott will take over again with the class in here, but I appreciate the opportunity that I've had to study with you. We've been studying human suffering. You all remember the story of David and his son, Absalom, and the fact that David was the king of Israel and Absalom wanted to be the king. So he began to try to take the kingdom from his father. And finally, he had to send his army into battle, trying to take it by force. David called his army captains in and told them, put down this rebellion, destroy his army, but don't harm a hair on that boy's head. That's really what he meant. He did not want Absalom to be hurt. There was a great battle out on the battlefield, and David's army won a great victory. David was too old to go into battle then. He stayed at home and he was waiting in the gate for news of the battle. David's army won a victory. And then Absalom himself was killed on the field of battle. A messenger was sent to David to bear the news to him. And in 2 Samuel 18, beginning with verse 31, we read, And behold, Cushai came, and Cushai said, Tidings, my lord the king, for the Lord hath avenged thee this day of all them that rose up against thee. And the king said unto Cushai, Is the young man Absalom safe? He didn't ask, did we win the battle? How many men did we lose? He was concerned about that boy. Is the young man Absalom safe? And Cushai answered, The enemies of my lord the king, and all that rise against thee to do thee hurt, be as that young man is. And David knew then that the son was killed. And the king was much moved, and went up to the chamber over the gate, and wept. And as he went, thus he said, O Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee. O Absalom, my son, my son. Numerous times I've heard this passage used by preachers to talk about parents who have failed their children. And that's a good use of it. It's a legitimate use of it, because this is a good illustration of the fact that a father can lose his son. I have no doubt that David had many reasons for which he could blame himself for the loss of Absalom. There was that affair with Bathsheba. You remember it. David sinned grievously and then had her husband killed to try to cover his sin. And then there were the affairs of state. David was the king of Israel. He had a lot of responsibilities as the king. He used to go into battle and fight battles as well. And then there was the polygamy that David committed before his sons. You remember that he had 8 wives and 25 children. He didn't have time to give to the training of one of his boys. He had too many wives, too many children, too many responsibilities, and David failed as a father. Many times this has been used to talk about fathers who failed. I've used it that way. It's a legitimate use of this story. But I would like to use it in a little different sense today. I'd like for us to think about a wounded father, the grief of David as he learned that his son was killed. I'd like for us to think about the grief of David and let that grief tear at our hearts as we consider our own situation, as we talk about wounded parents. I know that there's a possibility that I'm talking to someone in this auditorium or online who has been wounded by children who are not living as they ought to live. I know that it is difficult to talk to any group of people without having someone in the audience who is a wounded parent. I'm not trying to identify anyone particularly. I do not know your situation, but I'm simply saying that there are many people who have become wounded parents because of the way their children are living. It's hard to find a family that has not suffered it in some way. Parents are wounded in many ways. It may be a call from a policeman at the station saying, we have arrested your son because he's been using illegal drugs and selling illegal drugs. It may be a call late in the night from the hospital and the spokesman says, there's been a terrible accident in a car wreck. Your daughter has been seriously injured. And you ask, what happened? They said, we don't know everything about it, but it seems that drugs are involved and drinking is involved. It may be a daughter who comes in and tells you that she's pregnant, 18 years old, not married. It may be a son who comes to tell you that he is gay. There are many ways in which people can suffer and be wounded as parents. When you feel that your life has been shattered and you don't know what to do and you're filled with grief as David was, I'd like to suggest some things that hopefully will be helpful to you. If you are a wounded parent, maybe a mother, father, grandparent, or a near kinsman, it may well be that this can apply to you. Maybe when you go to bed at night and you think about that child who is not living properly, and the words of David ring out in your ears through the night. Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. And we think of it because of our own son or daughter who is not living properly. I'd like to make maybe 4 suggestions. And the first one may not be as well appreciated and accepted as some of the others. I'd like to suggest, first of all, that you recognize your failures. If you have failed, if you have not been the faithful Christian you should have been before those children, you'll need to acknowledge it. If you're ever going to find peace, you will have to confess your faults. I remember a man who was a good friend of mine in a congregation where I was preaching. He had 2 sons. He and his wife had 2 sons that were barely grown, about 19 and 21, and the older one was married. But they were not living as they ought to live. And I remember the time that father came to see me, and with tears in his eyes, he begged me to help him try to save those boys. He said, concerning himself, it's my fault. When our boys were young, my wife and I were just Sunday morning Christians. We were not really committed, not really involved in Christianity. We just drop in for worship on Sunday morning, and that was it. We never brought them to Bible class. Didn't come back to worship God on Sunday night. Didn't bring those boys to Bible class on Wednesday night. He said it's my fault, our fault. But he needed help in trying to save those boys. Someone has asked this question. Why do young people suffer when parents fail them? Well, I can think of 3 reasons they suffer. Number 1, because of ignorance. If we don't bring those boys and girls to Bible classes Sunday morning and Wednesday night, and Sunday night to worship God and hear another sermon from the Word of God, they're going to miss some truths that might have saved their soul. And so if we have been careless, indifferent as Christians, not really committed to God all the way, those young people are going to suffer because they don't know some things. Number 2, because of the example that has been set before them. They're not serving God because Mom and Daddy didn't really serve God. Mom and Daddy just dropped in for worship on Sunday morning, and that was it. They were not in love with God enough to come back to worship Him on Sunday night or to come to Bible class on Wednesday night. And so those young people have not had an example to follow. Number 3, they haven't been motivated to live for God, really be committed to God. And so children suffer when Mom and Daddy have not been really faithful to the Lord. Mom and Dad, if you don't bring those boys and girls to Bible class on Sunday morning, Wednesday night, if you don't show them how to live Christianity and be back to worship God because you love Him with all of your heart on Sunday night, you're laying the groundwork for the loss of those boys and girls. I can tell you from my observation of over 60 years of preaching, that's one of the things that causes young people to go astray. And so I like to suggest, if that's true of you, if when those children were young, you were busy getting started with a business and you didn't have the time you ought to have had to train them, admit that fact. If you were not a Christian when your boys and girls were young, and so you didn't lead them in that direction because you were not a Christian, then confess that fact. If you have not been the faithful Christian, dedicated all the way as you should have been, admit that fact. No one bats 1,000. There are no perfect people. Ball players don't bat 1,000. If they can get 3 hits out of 10 times at bat, they can make over $1 million in baseball. Doctors don't bat 1,000. They don't save all the boys and girls and older people they treat. You might also remember that others failed as well. Parents sometimes fail. Homemakers fail. No one bats 1,000 in every area. Preachers don't. Preachers don't convert all the people they try to teach and lead to Christ. And so it's possible for us to fail because of failure on our part to live right as we ought to live. We may be good people. Most people who are members of the church would describe themselves as good people. They might say, we bring our children to worship every Sunday morning. That's it. Or we send them. But if we haven't been the committed parents that we ought to be, we may well have caused our young people to be lost. In John 17, verse 12, when Jesus was praying, he mentioned to the Father that he had kept all of those that were given to him, but one. Judas Iscariot went astray. Not because Jesus was imperfect, but because he was working with clay that was not good. Judas was not the proper kind of clay. And so I like to say that there is a catharsis, a relief that may come to your heart. If you have failed and it's your fault, admit it, confess it, repent of it, and ask God to forgive you, and then accept that forgiveness. I have known of people who confessed their sins, repented of them, asked God to forgive them, but they didn't accept the forgiveness. And so you'll need to ask God to forgive you, and then accept God's forgiveness, and be as faithful as you can be from then on. And maybe your example then might lead them back to the Lord. So face up to the fact that you may be the cause of your child's prodigality. Admit it, confess it, pray to God for forgiveness as you repent, and then accept His forgiveness. Number 2, realize that your child is a free moral agent. It's hard for us to realize that. That child will have to make a decision for himself. He is a free moral agent. He's not a puppet that you can control with strings. He is not a robot that you can control with a switch. That child is a free moral agent, and he has to accept that teaching. Now, you can train him, you can teach him, you can show him how to live, you can urge him and encourage him to live that way, but in the final analysis, he will have to accept that teaching. Solomon did not always follow the teaching of his father, and his children didn't either. In Proverbs 6, verse 20, he said, "My son, keep my father's commandments. Keep thy father's commandments. And forsake not the law of thy mother." Why did he give that admonition? Because it's possible for one to reject his father's teachings and to turn against the laws of his mother. It's possible for people to disobey their parents. There are 2 great influences in the lives of us all. One is heredity. That's what you are when you're born. You're born with certain characteristics. And then environment is the other one. Now, environment has to do with what happens to them after they are born. Now, some babies are born with fragile nervous systems and with certain characteristics that make them more willing to obey. They're more compliant. They're more willing to obey their parents. And if that is the case, then you can give them a little more rope. Then there are children that are born with their own mind. They want to do what they want to do. And if that's the case, you have to shorten the rope. Don't give them as much freedom. But this text that we're going to notice indicates that you need to train a child according to the tenor of his way. You consider the differences in children. There is no cookie-cutter plan to train all children. You have to train them according to their characteristics. And so sometimes children go astray because the parents haven't considered their characteristics, their abilities, knowledge, and so on, and they did not train them properly. Parents play a very important role in the training of their children, but they are by no means the only teachers of those children. Now, if I ask you who is responsible for the training of these boys and girls, all of us would say the parents are, but they're not the only ones. There are others who play a part in it as well. What about peer pressure? The peers of young people. Sociologists tell us that at certain ages, peer pressure will be a stronger influence upon those children than mom and daddy will. And you can do the best you can. You can be a faithful Christian. You can teach them well. You can fulfill your responsibility. But peer pressure may lead them away. In which case, you're not responsible. Keep that in mind. What about teachers? Will they influence children? They certainly will. There are teachers who can lead children in the wrong way. There are teachers who will teach children the theory of evolution, which says there is no God. Everyone just came into being and everything came into being by accident or chance. And there is no God. If that's true, the Bible is not the Word of God. You can just throw it away. That's what's happening in America today. There are so many children being brought up to believe the theory of evolution and that there is no God. Therefore, there is no standard of morality. You can live as you want to live. That's why some young people go astray. You can do the best you can, but if they get hold of a teacher who teaches them the wrong thing, they can lead them astray. I'm glad we have men like Jonathan and Nick and his wife Jenny and others of you who may be teachers, because you can believe that they're going to influence those children in the right way. We're grateful for them. What about preachers? Will they influence children? They will indeed, and ought to, but in the right way. But teachers and preachers can influence children in the wrong way. When I was preaching for the Concord Street Church in Orlando many years ago, we were planning one of these spiritual growth workshop sessions. That thing grew to the point that there were 3,000 or so in attendance. And at that time, there was a young man that we knew about who had built up a good reputation as a speaker for young people, had great ability to make connection with young people. And we invited him to come to speak at that spiritual growth workshop. A few years later, the brotherhood learned that he was a pedophile. He was doing things with young boys that are unspeakable. He was arrested, tried, and sent to prison for 15 years. His face was plastered on the front of a newspaper. Gospel preacher. Can preachers lead people astray? They can indeed. They do things like that or teach false doctrine. Preachers can lead people to do better. And I rejoice that we have men like Scott and David who are trying to do the right thing and lead people in the right way. We're grateful for them. But preachers also can influence young people. Teachers can influence young people. What about producers of TV shows? Can they influence young people? They surely can. When you see some of these shows today, almost every one of them glorifies immoral sex in some way, or drinking, other things that are bad. What about producers of movies? Can they lead people astray? They surely can. We don't usually turn on the TV until nighttime, and then we have to spend a lot of time. Mackie spends a lot of time trying to find some program that we can watch that would be decent and that we would enjoy. If you try to see some of these movies that are now shown on TV, sometimes we've tried some, we'll look for a while, and then they begin to use gutter language. They begin to produce pictures of nude people and this and that, and we say we can't watch stuff like that. We turn it to something else. I'm afraid if I hear some of that gutter language, it'll be embedded in my memory, and when I get old and lose my mind, I might spout out some of those words that are embedded in my mind, and I don't want to hear any of that. Producers of TV shows and movies can influence our young people. You see, Mom and Dad, you're not the only teacher of those young people. Now, if I ask you, to whom is Solomon speaking when he says, train up a child in the way he should go? We'd say, Mom and Daddy. They are, in the final analysis, the ones who will be with them most of the time, have greatest influence, but they're not the only teachers. You can do the best you can. You can be a faithful Christian. You can teach them properly, and someone else can lead them astray. Well, someone says, then what about Proverbs 22 and 6? Proverbs 22 and 6. Many parents know something about what that passage says, though they might not be able to find it. And many parents are suffering because they've misunderstood that verse and because some of it has been mistranslated. This passage has been misused, abused, confused, and even refused sometimes. The passage teaches the truth when God gave it in the original language. But you know, interpreters sometimes can misinterpret something, or translators can mistranslate something. When I was young, I just spouted off what I've always been told. Parents are wholly responsible for the rearing of their children, and if the children go astray, it is proof that parents have failed. That's not necessarily true. Then I studied the passage for myself, did a lot of studying on it through the years, and I found that that is not the proper interpretation of that verse. I studied from men like Guy N. Woods. You can't find a more conservative man than Guy N. Woods. I don't believe you can find a greater biblical scholar than Guy N. Woods was. He said, the phrase, in the way he should go, is often misapplied. The assumption is that it means in the way of righteousness and the true religion, which, of course, everyone should follow. But this is not what Solomon meant. And I might add, that's not what Solomon said in the original text. The Hebrew phrase from which the words, in the way he should go, means according to the tenor of his way. This is in harmony with his disposition, his natural talents, and individual character. Taught here is the obligation of parents to study the nature and disposition of their children and to train them accordingly. I found that to be the truth. And you'll find that in such commentaries as Albert Barnes, who has a good commentary. He says it should be translated in the tenor of his way. That's what Brother Woods was saying. I thought I would check it again if I could and talk to a Hebrew scholar and see what he says on the original text and what it means in English. Maybe you've heard of that scholar. His name is Scott Gleaves. He's a Hebrew scholar. He probably knows Hebrew better than Guy N. Woods did. Guy N. Woods knew Hebrew. He told me he studied under a Hebrew scholar, a Jewish rabbi, but he was not a teacher of Hebrew. Scott probably knows it better than he does. I asked Scott to check the original language on that phrase that's translated in the way he should go and tell me what it says in English. He did, and he's saying the same thing Guy N. Woods taught, Albert Barnes and other Hebrew scholars have taught. The passage is saying, train up a child according to his natural abilities, knowledge, his attitude, and so on. You consider each child and train him. That's what the passage is saying. And sometimes people read that passage and they say it says, train him up in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Well, that is misunderstood too. You know, a proverb is a statement that is generally true. It is a statement of something that's generally true, but not always. There are exceptions to them. You remember the Bible says in Hebrews 9:27, it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this the judgment. you're going to die. Are there exceptions? There have been 2 exceptions to it. In Proverbs chapter 15:1, Solomon said, a soft answer turneth away wrath. It can do that, but it might get you hit in the head too. Somebody might get mad that you're trying to be nice and hit you. In Proverbs chapter 16, verse 7, he said, when a man's ways please the Lord, he maketh even his enemies to be at peace with him. Did the ways of Christ please the Lord? Please God, it did. Did God make his enemies to be at peace with him? No. The ways of Paul pleased the Lord. Did God make his enemies to be at peace with him? No. They put him to death. A proverb is a statement of a general truth. It's general truth. It's generally going to come to pass, but not always. And so when Solomon said, when he is old, he will not depart from it, he did not give a hard and fast rule or a prophecy that said everybody's going to remain faithful. That doesn't conform to reality. You can teach a child properly, be a faithful Christian before him, and he can still be led astray. If we say he cannot fall from it, that's teaching the impossibility of apostasy. But the Bible says, Christ is become of no effect unto you. Whosoever of you have justified by the law, ye are fallen from grace. Galatians 5:4. One can fall from grace. A child can fall from grace. Even though he's been a Christian, even though he's been taught well and properly, he can fall from grace. You've seen children brought up in the same home. One becomes a faithful Christian, the other becomes a rascal, unfaithful. I've told you about Brother George Bailey. Great man, great gospel preacher. I knew him personally, heard him preach a number of times in meetings where I have been preaching. I've heard him tell about his brother. George Bailey was a great man, great, faithful gospel preacher. But he said his brother grew up to be a drunkard. Turned away from the Lord, drifted all over the country as a drunken bum. He said sometimes we didn't even know where he was. And I've heard Brother Bailey say there have been times when I've been preaching the gospel on one side of the street and my brother was in jail on the other side of the street. How do you explain that? 2 men brought up under the same faithful, godly Christian parents, brought up in the same way, same teaching, same influence. One becomes a faithful Christian and the other turns away from the Lord. That's because children are free moral agents. They can accept the teaching of the parents or they can reject it. That happens sometimes. Should we just reject a person who wants to be baptized because he's come up in the wrong environment? Should we say, he can't change? You might as well say that if you say if one's brought up in the right way, he can't change. If one is true, the other is true. If a child who's brought up right will not depart from it or cannot depart from it, then one who's been brought up in the wrong way can't change either. I'm glad the church in Winter Garden, Florida, didn't believe that idea, that one can't change. I'm glad the teachers at the Christian Home and Bible School did not believe that idea. They might have said, we might as well not try to do anything with old Charlie. He's come up in the wrong environment. His daddy was a drunkard, an adulterer, a thief, immoral in his language. Charlie's never seen his mom or daddy inside a church building. No need to try to help him. I'm glad. They didn't believe that. The idea that you can't change if you've been brought up in the right way or if you've been brought up in the wrong way. All of us can change because we are free moral agents. What Solomon is saying is if you train him as you ought, considering the differences in the children, and you teach them according to the will of God, generally they will keep it with them all their lives. But that is not an unalterable rule. They can go astray. So let me suggest that you not beat yourself down emotionally when you've done the best you knew how. You were a faithful Christian. You trained them as best you could, and they still went astray. You're not responsible for it when you have done your job. You've done it well. You've been a faithful Christian. I'm not just talking about being a good person. There are many people who are good people, but they're not really committed to Christ all the way. And if we're not really committed to Christ as parents, our children are not going to be fully committed to Christ either. They're going to walk in our steps. But when we do the best we can, we've been faithful Christians and taught them well, and they still go astray, parents, you're not responsible for that. Number 3, realize that God understands your grief. If there's anyone who understands what it means for his children to go astray, it's God. In the book of Hosea, chapter 11, verses 1 through 8, God refers to the people of Israel as his children. Israel was his son, his children. And yet they went astray, disobeyed God, worshiped idols. They turned away from God. And in that passage, God says in verse 5, my heart is turned within me. We can understand that when our children go astray. Our heart is turned within us. Our children can go astray. God's children have gone astray. If there's anyone in the world who understands what it means to be a wounded parent, it's God. Christ can understand what it means for his people not to obey him. In John 1 verse 11, we are told he came unto his own, and his own refused or confessed him not. They didn't obey him. His own people rejected him. In Matthew 23 verse 37, he said to the city of Jerusalem, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest them that are sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered thee unto me, as a hen doth gather her chickens under her wings, and ye would not. The Lord knows what it means to be a wounded parent. Jesus knows what it means for his people to turn against him. And so we need to understand that God understands, and he can help us. He knows what it is. And we need to go to him in prayer. Hebrews 4:15 and 16 tells us that Jesus came to this earth and he suffered as we suffered, knows all the emotions that we know. And we need to go to him. Let him help us. And then finally, reach out to your prodigal child. Don't burn the bridges. You have to build the bridges back from the child to home so he will come home. You may say, you don't realize how my child hurt me. You don't realize how deeply it hurt for him to go astray and to do all these things he's doing. And when he left, that day I said, never darken the door of my home again. We can understand how a person might feel that way when their children have turned astray, turned away from God, and are not living properly. Is that the way God treats us? When we sin, we come to God and ask him to forgive us. Does he ever say, that's the 4th time you've done that? That's the 4th time you've come back asking to be forgiven. Does he say, get away, don't ever approach me again? That's not the way God treats us, is it? In Romans 5 and verse 8, Paul said, but God commendeth his love toward us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. While we were sinners, he loved us. And that's the kind of love we need to have for our children, though it's difficult. We know it's difficult. But that's the kind of love we need to have for our children. His love, God's love, is unconditional. He loves us in spite of the fact that we're sinners. And we need to love our children unconditionally as well. It doesn't mean we accept what they're doing. It doesn't mean we want them to continue in those things, but it means we love them in spite of the fact that they have gone astray. God is not just interested in what you have been. He's interested in what you can be and what you want to be, and the Lord will help us. But I need to mention the fact that when we begin to bring those prodigals home, they're not going to be like they were when they left. They may come back as drunkards, Of course, we want them to quit. We want to try to help them to quit. But when they come back, they may have a diseased liver because of drinking. It may be that they come back as drug addicts. It may be that that daughter comes back pregnant, unmarried. That son may come back and tell you that he's going to be an unwed father. The children are not going to be like they were when they left. Think of the prodigal son. When he left that day, after he asked his father for his inheritance early, and his father gave it to him, you can picture him as he left, wearing his finest clothes, riding in the finest chariot that money can buy. He's got money in his pocket. He went into that far country and fell into unrighteous living. We can picture him going to the bar every day and buying drinks for everyone. As long as he had money, he had friends. He'd take a coin out of that sack and pay for it. But the day came when he shook that sack and the last coin fell out. His money is gone. He was hungry. What did he do? No one gave him any food. He had to go down and take a job feeding hogs. Very terrible job for a Jew because the hog was the most unclean animal to the Jews. Can you imagine how dirty and filthy that job was? Have you ever been around a hog pen? Have you ever really seen a hog pen? I have. Dirty, nasty, filthy, with a terrible smell. I was preaching in a meeting over in Ellijay, Georgia, years ago. When they built a new building there, they invited me to come preach in the first meeting in that building. You're familiar with that congregation. They're involved with the church here in this mission work. During that week, a man there who was a pig farmer invited me to come out to his farm and see his pigs. Now, he probably knew I've seen pigs before, but he was probably wondering what I was going to say. When we went out to his pig farm, I expected to see that old dirty, nasty pud of mud and all that, and the hogs wallowing all in it, and every kind of filth you can imagine with that terrible smell. But it wasn't that way. They were not in a mud puddle. They were on a concrete slab. They had the pig pen built on a concrete slab. So it didn't have all that mud up there. It had every other kind of filth, and the smell was the same. You can put a silk skirt on a pig, but he's still a pig. He's going to have the same nature, going to do the same things, have the same smell. So I understand what a pig pen looks like and smells like. I said to that pig farmer, it's a little odoriferous. He said, it smells like money to me. Depends on your perspective, of course. But I understand what a pig pen was like. Can you imagine how dirty and filthy it was, and how dirty and filthy that prodigal son became? Out there wallowing in that mess, feeding them. He became dirty and filthy and smelly. If he had had the opportunity to pick up his cell phone and call Daddy back at home and said, Daddy, I want to come home. If he had had that opportunity, what do you think that daddy would have said? He'd say, come on home, son. We can burn those old clothes, or we can wash them. You can take a shower. You can put on cologne. We can deal with all that. I want you to come home. If that father had not had that love for him, if that son had not known that his father loved him, he probably would not have come home. Do you think so? He came home because he knew his father loved him. Now, that father probably would say, I'll try to be as forgiving as I can. I'll forgive you 70 times 7. But I want you to come home. I want you to change and come back home. But our boys and girls are not going to come back home as they were when they left. But you need to love them. Build a bridge so they can come back. I read a story a number of years ago. I've read it a number of times since then. It comes to us from the Second World War. There was a mom and dad who had a boy in the war fighting in the Pacific with Japan. They were always on pins and needles. If a car stopped out front, they were afraid it'd be military officers come to tell us that the boy was killed. They were constantly afraid. But one night, they received a phone call. Mom answered the phone, and it was her son calling from San Francisco. He said, "Mom, I'm coming home." And she was just as excited as she could be. Told her husband, who was standing nearby. They were just rejoicing that he was coming home. She said, "When will you get home?" He said, "Well, I'm in San Francisco right now, and if I can get a plane out tonight, I'll be home tomorrow." And he said, "I need to tell you, Mom, that I'm going to have to bring my buddy home with me. We've been through a lot together in this war. He has been tragically injured. He has only one eye, one arm, and one leg. And so I'm going to bring him home with me." And his mother said, "That'll be fine, son. We'd be glad to meet him. We'd be glad for him to stay with us a few days." He said, "You don't understand, Mom. He's helpless. Somebody's going to have to take care of him. And so I want him to come home with us permanently." And his mother was a little hesitant. But she said, "Okay, bring him home with you and we'll talk about it." They talked a little more and then hung up. The next day, a military car pulled up at their house, and two officers got out and came to the door and introduced themselves. And they said, "Are you Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so?" And they said, "Yes." "And you're the parents of Sergeant so-and-so?" And they said, "Yes." They said, "We are sorry to inform you, but your son has been killed." And they were shocked to the core. They said, "We just talked to him last night, and he said he was going to be home today if he could get a flight out. What happened?" And these officers said, "We don't really know the details, but it appears that he jumped off the top of a tall hotel in San Francisco. They said his body will be delivered to the nearest funeral home, and they'll call you when it arrives." In 2 or 3 days, they received a call from the funeral home. And they went to the funeral home and were led into the room where the casket of their son was. The casket was opened, and they saw the body of their son. And they noticed that he had one eye, one arm, and one leg. And they knew that he was talking about himself when he said, "I'm going to have to bring a buddy home with me. Somebody's going to have to take care of him." And he had the impression that his mother was a little hesitant. He was really testing her love and whether she wanted him to come in that condition. That's the way your boys and girls may come home from the far country. It may be that they'll come home injured or changed in some way, but we need to love them. If we don't, you'll never come home. We have hurting parents, wounded parents, and we need help. And God is the answer. In all of these ways of suffering that we've talked about this quarter, the bottom line has always been, take it to God. Pray to God, and He'll help us. We need help. God can help us. And we need to comfort one another. Wherefore comfort ye one another. We appreciate the fact that you've listened well today and throughout this quarter. And I appreciate the opportunity to study with you. May the Lord bless us all.